I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas.
Believe it or not, and I know most people do not, violence has been in decline for long stretches of time, and today we are probably living in the most peaceful era in our species' existence.
This is psychologist Steven Pinker. He's the author of The Better Angels of Our Nature, a book about how violence has decreased over the course of human history.
The decline of violence has not been steady, it has not brought rates of violence down to zero, and it is not guaranteed to continue. But I hope to persuade you that it is a persistent historical development, visible on scales from millennia to years, from wars and genocides to the treatment of children and animals.
Steven Pinker teaches at Harvard and was in Winnipeg to deliver a talk as part of a series at the new Canadian Museum for Human Rights, a series called Fragile Freedoms. His lecture drew heavily from his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, and that book is jammed with charts and graphs illustrating the general decrease in violence.
Ordinarily, I try to tell my story in graphs. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation has told me that that doesn't work so well on the radio, and so I will have to try to persuade you in words and gestures, the social science equivalent of playing air guitar. For those of you listening on the radio, I'm going to be making a lot of gestures in which my hand starts on the top left of an imaginary rectangle and wiggles down to the bottom right. And the fact that I will be making that gesture so often this evening is the way that I hope to convince you.
Today on Ideas, and totally without graphs, some excerpts from Steven Pinker's lecture, along with an interview I did with him after his Winnipeg talk. You'll also hear a lot of the question period after the talk, because this decrease in violence seemed to contradict what we see on the news, and even our general understanding of human history. So maybe it was only appropriate that Steven Pinker began by talking about prehistory.
Until around 6,000 years ago, humans everywhere lived in anarchy without central government. What was life like in this state of nature? This is a topic that thinkers have pondered literally for centuries. In 1651, Thomas Hobbes famously wrote that in a state of anarchy, the life of man was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A century later, Jean-Jacques Rousseau countered that nothing can be more gentle than man in his primitive state. Now, neither of these gentlemen knew what they were talking about. They had no idea what life was like in a so-called state of nature. But today we can do better because there are two sources of data on rates of violence in non-state societies. The first is forensic archaeology. You can think of this as CSI Paleolithic. Namely, what proportion of prehistoric skeletons show signs of unhealed violent trauma, such as bashed-in skulls, decapitations, bones found with arrowheads embedded in them, the Stone Age equivalent of the smoking gun, or preserved mummies found with ropes around their necks. I have found in the literature 20 quantitative estimates. They span quite a range from 0 to 60%, but they average out to 15%. Now, is that a high number or a low number by modern standards? Well, consider that in Europe and the United States in the 20th century, notorious for 2 world wars and many other wars, the comparable rate of violent death was 0.6%. If you try to get the upper bounded estimate, the highest credible estimate of how many people died in the famously violent 20th century from violence, adding up the deaths from wars, both direct deaths on the battlefield and indirect deaths from disease and starvation in the wake of war, add on to those numbers the victims of genocides, and add on to those numbers the victims of intentional man-made famines, you can boost the rate up to about 3%. Remember, we're comparing it to 15% from archaeological specimens. And if you look at the figure for the world in the 21st century, the graph that I would show has a bar that is invisible because it is less than 1 pixel high, coming in at a rate of 3/100ths of 1%. Now, the second source of evidence on rates of violence in non-state societies comes from ethnographic vital statistics. The wave of agriculture and settled societies and government that swept over the world starting around 6,000 years ago left a few pockets of anarchy on the planet, namely hunter-gatherer, hunter-horticulturalist, and other tribal societies. And ethnographers who've lived with them for long stretches of time have recorded their causes of death in various categories, including warfare. Once again, I've assembled every quantitative statistic I could find in the literature. There were 27 different societies. And once again, they do span a considerable range, from 0 all the way up to almost 1,500 per 100,000 per year, a conventional way of comparing rates of violence across times and places. They average out to 524 per 100,000 per year. That is, every year, 0.5% of the population is killed in warfare. Is 524 per 100,000 a high number or a low number? Once again, let's look at comparable figures for the 20th century, including some of the countries that witnessed the most horrific forms of violence in the 20th century, such as Germany, whose rate was 144 per 100,000 per year, including all the deaths from the two world wars. Russia in the 20th century, 2 world wars and a civil war, comes in at a rate of 135. Japan, a world war that ended in not 1 but 2 nuclear strikes with a rate of 27. The United States fought in 2 world wars and at least half a dozen other foreign wars. Its rate was 3.7. Again, if you aimed for the largest credible estimate for the world as a whole in the famously violent 20th century, adding up the direct and indirect deaths from war, from genocide, and from man-made famines, you could get the rate up to about 60. And in the 21st century, the comparable figure for the world is about 1/3 of a war death per 100,000 per year. Remember, we're comparing all these numbers to the 524 per 100,000 per year for tribal and other anarchic societies. So not to put too fine a point on it, but when it comes to life in a state of nature, Hobbes was right, Rousseau was wrong.
When you look at like medieval times or even pre-medieval times, which are times that you're considering in the book and in the lecture, how do you establish those as facts?
It depends on the part of the world and the time period, but homicides have always fascinated people, and they are easy to count because a dead body is a dead body. And then, there can be debates over the circumstances of a killing, but compared to other crimes and acts of violence that don't leave as clear a record, a corpse is a pretty unambiguous sign that of foul play in most cases. And governments have been interested in homicide for a long time because they, in the Middle Ages, had the brilliant idea of confiscating the assets of the family of the perpetrator. And so you would have a official of the king, of the crown, who would make a tour of England once a year, going from town to town to tally up all of the homicides that took place in the preceding year so that the government could get its share of the chattels of the perpetrator. And in fact, we have a name for that agent of the crown. We call him a coroner to this day. And so in many parts of Europe, statistics on homicide go back literally 800 years. They're not perfectly reliable for a number of reasons, but when you're talking about a decline of an order of 35 or 50, then even a major inaccuracy of the data, like twice as many or half as many, isn't going to alter the conclusion. Likewise, there's just, no matter how you count battle deaths, and that's something that several organizations in the world try to do, mostly in Scandinavia, the difference between Vietnam and Afghanistan, for example, to say nothing of World War II, is so massive that even if you're wrong by a factor of 2 or 3, it's not going to change the overall trend. We're talking about changes in orders of magnitude, that is, the number of zeros on the death toll.
In your lecture and in your book, you talked about a general trend towards less violence. And in both the lecture and the book, you talked about various factors that seem to contribute to that trend. I'm wondering, though, there's such a diversity of societies around the world. How universal are these factors that are contributing to this trend to less violence?
They have different weight in different societies, but I think human nature is a universal. We all feel the need for revenge. We all are tempted to exploit one another. We all have a sense of empathy that can be turned on or turned off or ramped up or ramped down. And I think some of the factors that interact with those urges are universal as well. I think that some kind of governing authority, a third party, a disinterested agent that metes out justice is going to work in pretty much all societies. I think that the bonds of trade and exchange and commerce seem to be pacifying forces in everything from large industrial capitalist societies to the trading networks of more tribal societies. So how they're implemented from society to society is going to be very, very different. But I think that the factors actually show a lot of overlap.
What are the fundamental factors that we're battling against? And battling is probably not the right word to use, given that we're talking about violence and a trend either upwards or downwards. But what are we trying to transcend in human nature to become less violent?
We're dealing, first of all, with just sheer exploitation. The harming of a person that happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want. And that just requires that you not engage your sense of empathy, that you treat another human the way you would treat vermin or an inanimate object. And you see that in many kinds of violence, like getting rid of inconvenient native people who are occupying a land that you'd rather keep for yourself, in rape, exploiting the body of an unwilling woman, in eliminating a rival in drug turf, and so on. But actually, there are probably worse forms of violence that have no particular instrumental motive, no profit motive, but that are done for moralistic reasons, affecting justice, seeking revenge. Many of the worst genocides of the 20th century were done to implement idealistic, moralistic goals, to bring a utopia to Earth, a Marxist utopia or a Nazi utopia or a nationalist utopia. In earlier centuries, it would have been a religious utopia, where you can really ask what's in it for the killers. But what's in it is they are righting a wrong. They are implementing a plan. And even in ordinary, mundane street crime, a lot of violence is committed moralistically. Two men fight over a parking space, and one of them feels that there's been an intolerable insult and breach of justice for the guy who stole the space before that he was patiently waiting for. And so he'll do something stupid like challenge the other guy to a knife fight in order to seek justice. So if you were to add them up, I actually think that violence committed for moral goals probably claims more victims than violence committed out of raw exploitation and profit.
Although moral goals can lead humanity to violence, sometimes they decrease it, as during the so-called humanitarian revolution of the 1800s.
Also abolished during the humanitarian revolution were witch hunts, religious persecution, like burning heretics, dueling among men of honor, blood sports like bear baiting, debtors' prisons, and most famously of all, slavery. Slavery used to be legal everywhere on earth. No one seemed to think there was anything particularly wrong with it. The Bible had no problem with slavery. So-called democratic Athens was a slave-holding society. But beginning in the second half of the 18th century, there was a trickle of abolitions that eventually swept the world, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country to abolish slavery as a legal institution. So we have been living through a unique 34-year period in human history in which slavery has been illegal everywhere on earth. What were the immediate causes of the humanitarian revolution? Well, in combing through historical developments for something that took place prior to this remarkable period in the second half of the 18th century, I was able to come up with only one, and that is the rise of printing and literacy. If you plot economic efficiency of book production Just how much does it cost to produce and sell a book? There was a 25-fold increase prior to the 18th century. It is the only industry that showed an increase in productivity prior to the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century. That technology was put into practice, and the number of books published per decade skyrocketed during the 18th century, an early version of Moore's Law, which saw an exponential increase in the number of books published. And it was the 18th century when, for the first time, a majority of people in Western countries could read those books. That's when literacy crept above the 50% mark. Why should literacy matter? Well, there's another name for this era. It's also called the Enlightenment, because this is the era in which knowledge began to replace superstition and ignorance. And if you have a literate and educated populace, that is less likely to believe in pernicious nonsense, such as that Jews poison the wells, heretics go to hell, crop failures are caused by witches, children are possessed by the devil, which has to be beaten out of them, Africans are brutish and fit only for slavery, it's bound to undermine many rationales for institutionalized violence. As Voltaire said during this era, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Also, literacy is a technology of cosmopolitanism, of the mixing of people and ideas. And it's plausible that as people consume more fiction and drama and history and journalism, they get into the habit of seeing things from other people's points of view, of inhabiting other people's minds. And conceivably, that could make it harder to dehumanize people unlike yourself. It could expand people's sense of empathy and decrease their taste for cruelty and sadism.
This is Ideas on CBC Radio 1, on cbc.ca, and on SiriusXM. I'm Paul Kennedy. On this episode, some of the ideas of Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker. He's the author of The Better Angels of Our Nature, a best-selling book that explores a generally unnoticed but persistent decrease in human violence over recorded history. Dr. Pinker is speaking at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, walking the audience through his research and along the way upending some deeply ingrained assumptions.
Now, it is certainly true that World War II was the deadliest event in human history in terms of the absolute number of people who were killed. It's not as clear that it is the deadliest event in history in terms of the population of the world alive at the time that was killed. If you look at the 100 worst things that people have ever done to one another, a list that I got from a man who calls himself an atrocitologist, Matthew White, from his book, The Great Big Book of Horrible Things, and he lists the 100 worst. They are pretty evenly sprinkled over 2,500 years of human history. In fact, as a proportion of the world's population, World War II only comes in at 9th place, and World War I doesn't even make the top 10. Now, we can do better than simply listing terrible events as we get closer to the present and historical records start to become more complete. When it comes to deaths in war, there is one quantifiable data set that gives us some picture of the trends, and this is Jack Levy's data on great power wars. Great powers are empires or countries that can project military force beyond their own borders. They are the 800-pound gorillas of the era, and the wars that they get embroiled in are unlikely to have been missed by anyone at the time. And number two, because of the statistical distribution of deaths in wars, account for a majority of the deaths of all wars combined. So just by looking at the great power wars, you're getting a big chunk of the deaths in all wars. And here's what the trends look like. If you look at the frequency of wars involving a great power on at least one side over the last 500 years, you get a zigzaggy downward curve. Wars involving great powers have become less and less frequent. If you look at the duration of wars involving a great power, you get a zigzaggy curve going down. Wars have gotten shorter. Past centuries used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. The 20th century had the Six-Day War. However, there is one trend that went in the opposite direction during most of this half-millennium, and that is the deadliness of great power war. That is, once a great power picked a fight and started a war, how many people was it able to kill per country per year? And that curve, unfortunately, shows an increasing trend up until the end of World War II, where that too decreases. So for the last two-thirds of a century, we've been living through a unique period in which the wars have become less frequent, shorter, and less deadly per year of war. If you then zoom in just on the 20th century, you see that it certainly has two unmistakable spikes of bloodletting concentrated on the era of the two world wars. But contrary to predictions that this would be the beginning of an ascending crescendo and that World War III would be imminent and far worse, World War III never happened, and the graph for deaths in war after 1945, after these two huge spikes, basically looks like a wrinkled carpet of a few wiggles bouncing along the floor by historical standards.
Now here's where it gets a bit tricky. Dr. Pinker looks at numbers relative to total populations at any given time, not just body counts. Now, that's a vast oversimplification, because he also includes other forms of violence, but killing is a kind of bottom line for violence. So although there may be more actual deaths in any given period, they can still represent a relative decrease in violence simply because there are just more people around. And Steven Pinker says relative rates are what matters, because they're the best way to spot trends. It can be hard for people to wrap their minds around this, and we'll hear some of that puzzlement later. But Pinker first tries to answer the question that everyone, including him, is wondering about.
Why has violence declined on so many scales of time and magnitude? Could it be that human nature has changed and somehow people have lost their inclinations toward violence? We've just become a nicer species. Well, I consider this to be extremely unlikely for a number of reasons. One of them is that we continue to see high rates of violence in our unsocialized children. The Canadian psychologist Richard Tremblay has shown that the most violent age of life is not, as most people think, late adolescence in the early 20s, but rather the aptly named terrible twos. And as Tremblay has pointed out, the reason we don't know this violence is that there's only so much damage a two-year-old can do. But if we gave two-year-olds access to guns, we would quickly realize that a large percentage of two-year-olds kick, bite, hit, and inflict other forms of violence. Also, play fighting among little boys is the most robust cross-cultural universal sex difference. Grown-up little boys, and many grown-up little girls, continue to enjoy seeing violence enacted before their eyes, such as in murder mysteries, Greek tragedies, Shakespearean dramas, video games, movies starring a certain ex-governor of California, and not least the national sport of Canada. And then there are homicidal fantasies. Social psychologists, a number of them, have done the following study. They simply ask people this question: have you ever fantasized about killing someone? Okay. Well, the results are that about a quarter of women and a third of men frequently fantasize about killing people. About 60% of women and more than three-quarters of men at least occasionally fantasize about killing people. What does this tell us about human nature? It tells us that about a quarter of men are liars. A more likely possibility is that human nature is extraordinarily complex, and it has always encompassed both inclinations toward violence and inclinations that counteract them, what Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature. And what has changed is that historical circumstances increasingly favor our peaceable inclinations, our better angels. Well, what do I mean by motives or inclinations for violence? I don't think that there is a single thing called violence or aggression. I think there are all kinds of reasons that one person wants to harm another. One of them is just sheer exploitation, harming a person that happens to be an obstacle on the path to something that you want, resulting in forms of violence such as rape, plunder, conquest, the elimination of rivals and threats. Then there's a completely different category of violence motivated by dominance, the urge to climb the pecking order and become alpha male. And there's a similar urge that pits groups against groups for ethnic, racial, national, or religious supremacy. Yet another category is moralistic violence, basically revenge. The idea that it is not just permissible, but mandatory to inflict harm on someone who has committed a moral infraction, justice, resulting in things like vendettas, blood feuds, cruel punishments, and other forms of rough justice. Then there are toxic ideologies, generally involving a vision of utopia, such as those proposed by militant religions, by nationalism, by Nazism, by communism, which can justify vast outlays of violence by a kind of pernicious cost-benefit analysis. If you have a vision of a world that will be infinitely good forever, how much violence are you entitled to commit in order to bring that kingdom of heaven to earth? Well, as much as you want, and the ends always justify the means, because the ends are infinitely good forever. By the same token, imagine that you announce your scheme for an eternally perfect society, and there's some people who just don't buy it. They just don't get with the program. Well, they're the only thing standing in the way of a world that will be infinitely good forever. How evil are they? How important is it to get rid of them? Well, you do the math. As they used to say in the Soviet Union, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, ignoring the fact that human beings are not eggs. But explaining the apparent paradox that by far the worst episodes of massacre in human history have been motivated not by greed or avarice or exploitation, but rather by moralistic utopian ideologies. Well, all that sounds pretty depressing. What do we have in the head to counteract them? What are the better angels of our nature? Well, here again, there is not just a general capacity for goodness. There are a number of psychological components that can turn us away from violence. There's self-control, circuitry in the prefrontal cortex that can anticipate the consequences of behavior and inhibit our violent impulses. There's empathy, the ability to feel others' pain. There's the moral sense, a set of norms and taboos that govern just what you do and what you don't do if you want to be a decent member in your society. And then there's reason, cognitive processes that allow us to engage in objective, detached analyses. So now the question is, how do you bring the psychology back together with the history? What are the historical developments that bring out our better angels and stay our hands before they can commit acts of bloodshed? Well, one possibility is that Hobbes got it right when he called for a leviathan. That is a government, a state, and judicial system with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence.
Very early on in the lecture, you talk about the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, and you lament the fact that he's sort of been overlooked or not considered seriously enough by people since then. Can you walk us through what you consider to be Hobbes' crucial ideas?
Hobbes' main idea, which he got from Thucydides, the Greek historian, is that war is a natural state even among agents who have not a malevolent bone in their body, because they have to worry about their neighbors coveting what they have. And so they'll always be tempted either to wipe out their neighbors preemptively, which of course makes their neighbors tempted to wipe them out preemptively, or at the very least to be so tough and fierce and be willing to prove it that your neighbors will think twice about invading you. And if they do invade you, then you've got to, and you survive, then you have to be prepared to avenge the attack to prevent further ones in the future. So that's a cycle that intelligent agents will naturally fall into, and as long as they are social, they have bonds with each other, they'll come to each other's defense when any one of them is attacked. And so you have not only man against man homicide, but group against group war. Hobbes tried to think of what the way out of that dilemma was, and he basically came up with the idea of government, that if you have a power, a leviathan, that had a monopoly on the use of force, then by penalizing aggression, it would eliminate the temptation of one group to attack the other, which would have knock-on effects. Namely, if you don't have to worry about your neighbors attacking you because the government will penalize them, then you don't have to be tempted to wipe them out preemptively, and you don't have to be so tough that you can avenge any attack because you've outsourced your revenge to a disinterested third party. Now, Hobbes got a lot of things wrong, as you'd expect from someone who wrote 350 years ago. He didn't think through the problem that the Leviathan would not be a disinterested moral agent, but a bunch of human beings who would then be tempted to exploit their own people, given the power that they have accrued. And so he didn't quite get democracy, although he vaguely imagined that the sovereign or government would embody the will of the people, that it would embody a kind of social contract where everyone agrees to turn over their power to attack their neighbors over to the sovereign or the authority. But he didn't think through the mechanisms that would prevent the sovereign from usurping power and causing more violence than it prevents.
Hobbes' Leviathan is a sort of explanation of the important role that states and governments play in controlling violence, but violence implies some sort of needed degree of authority, maybe even authoritarianism. You were speaking at a museum for human rights, and human rights imply almost the opposite, some sort of basic idea of the importance of the individual. How do you balance Hobbes' Leviathan with the rights of the individual?
Well, the good thing about a government is that it can prevent your neighbors from attacking you, and the bad thing about a government is that it can attack both you and your neighbors to keep itself in power. And democracy is an attempt to get the advantages of government without the disadvantages. Hobbes had a vague notion of democracy. He actually drew the Leviathan on the cover of his book as made up out of lots and lots of itty-bitty little people. And he imagined, without really thinking through, that somehow the Leviathan would embody the collective will of the people. But Leviathans are, in practice, human beings with all the usual human flaws. And so you really need some kinds of constraints on what a government can do, which I consider to be the essence of democracy. Not just the orderly exit of a Leviathan and his replacement by a new Leviathan to make sure that the will of the people continue to be represented, but also certain lines that Leviathan can't cross, that Leviathan can't decide to sacrifice people to make an example or to further its own power and glory. And human rights largely consist of lines that we don't allow governments or any other organized human force to cross.
Steven Pinker is the author of The Better Angels of Our Nature. I'm Paul Kennedy, and this is Ideas on CBC Radio 1 and CBC.ca. This episode is drawn from an interview with Dr. Pinker and from a lecture he delivered at the new Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg. This lecture was part of a series of talks called Fragile Freedoms. We've been broadcasting all of them on Ideas. Dr. Pinker's thorough presentation about decreasing rates of violence provoked some questions. This is Terry McLeod of CBC Radio in Winnipeg.
Perhaps I could ask a question to begin, Professor Pinker. What place does this institution have in spreading the ideas of building a less violent society?
Contrary to the impression you might get that it's a kind of banal, uncontroversial concept like motherhood and apple pie and peace and love, and it's actually human rights is an unusual, exotic, and unfamiliar concept, I think, in human history. You don't see a whole lot of moral codes until fairly recently advocating the idea that the ultimate moral good consists of the rights of individual men, women, and children. You certainly have plenty of glorifications of the tribe, of particular religious creeds, of nations, of glorification of patriotism, of honor, of glory. But the idea that we shouldn't care about glory, we shouldn't care about the ascendancy or spread of our religion, we shouldn't care about the group that we happen to belong with, all that counts are men, women, and children. that is like this weird, radical, crazy, counterintuitive idea, because you see it. Historians of ideas have traced the concept of human rights, and it appears in dribs and drabs through history. Certainly the first major invocation of it came prior to the French Revolution, and that didn't end out too well. But then again, there was a big burst for obvious reasons, after World War II, culminating in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which again, you'd say, sappy aspiration, just like singing Kumbaya, what good could that do? But in fact, the history of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I hope that will be featured in this museum, is actually fascinating, that the world had to be dragged kicking and screaming to affirm what we might take for granted, like all people have rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt certainly deserves a huge amount of credit for being an amazing charmer, arm twister, hardball politician in getting it passed remarkably after something like 135 drafts, but she just would not give up, and she made it happen. Why was it so tough? Well, the United States had this wee little problem in the late 1940s of its Negroes. The United Kingdom had this wee problem of its colonies, to say nothing of the Soviet Union, which abstained, as did the entire Eastern Bloc. So no, the idea that people count nations, tribes, religions don't is a wild and crazy recent idea, but at least as far as human common sense is concerned. But it's a really, really good idea, and it's the idea that I think is a kind of common denominator, in as much as these trends were driven by ideas, and not all of them were. Some of them were driven by economics. But to the extent they were driven by ideas, human rights really sits at the center of it. And we have to remember that it is not obvious. And I'll just give one other example of something that's not human rights that we also embrace, not exactly realizing that it contradicts human rights, and that is sovereignty. The idea that the world is divided into patches by lines. Each one of them is run by a government, and the government has the right to do what it wants within those borders, and it's no one else's business. There are reasons that sovereignty is something to respect, because you don't want constant invasions. But on the other hand, the idea of sovereignty and the idea of human rights are two very different ideas. That governments get to do what they want within their borders is not valid if you think I have a common interest with all of the human beings in some other guy's country. And yes, it is my business. If I believe in human rights, then it does have to be my business. So again, it's not an obvious idea.
We have some questions from the floor. Go ahead, sir.
Dr. Pinker, my name is Peter Denton. I'm Associate Professor of History Adjunct at the Royal Military College of Canada. And I'd like to say on behalf of my colleagues and students that we really wish you were right. But I fear that there are problems with the analysis, and one of the things that I would like to ask you to discuss is you seem to have an extremely elastic definition of violence. It moves across boundaries, across disciplines, across the types of data that you've collected, and we could get into some interesting conversations around that. But I would ask you the question tonight, is that one type of violence that you have really not discussed is economic violence. So that in terms of the variety of forms of economic violence, which from the victim's perspective are just as lethal as a bullet, how would you then evaluate the condition of our planet as we move toward those planetary boundaries as a result of those kinds of economic activities and the violence that it entails?
Well, I'm beginning by pointing out the irony of alluding to elastic definitions of violence. I define violence as violence, namely the direct, the intentional infliction of damage on another sentient being, including homicide, rape, assault, kidnapping, or the threats thereof, whether done by individuals or groups, such as armies or nations. If you truly use an elastic definition of violence and say, when there's any economic arrangement that I feel is exploitative, I'm going to call that violence, that's the elastic definition. Because that means that you could look anywhere in the world, decide that some group of workers aren't being paid as much as you think they are, call that violence. But in which case, you could look at the entire world a couple of hundred years ago when everyone was poor and say everyone was a victim of violence. So I think that if you use violence metaphorically to refer to economic arrangements that you deem to be unjust, that is such an elastic concept that you lose the ability to understand changes in history. You also lose the ability to reduce what everyone would agree are acts of violence. That is, I think there's a big difference between underpaying workers and Auschwitz, or the 30 Years' War, or sticking a knife into someone's liver. And I think it's very important to keep those distinct, rather than trying to import the moral opprobrium that we direct against unambiguous, clear-cut, non-elastic violence, and trying to mobilize that for other forms of injustice or conditions that we deplore in the world. There are lots of things that are wrong in the world that don't, by any reasonable definition, consist of violence. And I think if you want to understand the world, you've got to not let language confuse understanding by stretching terms in a moralistic way, but use the word violence to refer to violence.
Two more questions.
Thanks, Terry. There's something disturbing, something distressing, something disappointing about the talk. And, I'm sorry, I'm a critic.
We're killing each other less.
So,
oh, damn, that's such bad news. But yes, go ahead. Why are you upset that violence has gone down?
First of all, there are major philosophical problems that you're raising, that you're taking on in this book. And speaking in an institution like this, it makes it very important. But you have emphasized statistics. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I feel a little bit a victim of the statistical approach that you have taken. Because if we agree, and I'm not sure that we should, that human rights is something that is evaluated on the level of an individual human rights, as opposed to group human rights, or, for example, privileged over group rights. And if we can say that that is the measure, and I'm not sure that I agree that we should, but if we do say that it's at the level of the individual, then these statistics are irrelevant. And whether or not violence at a global scale is increasing or decreasing is irrelevant to the question of justice as it is experienced by a human being.
Well, that makes no sense. For one thing,
I could speak longer, but we have limited time.
Yes.
So I will just return my question to a general category of statistics and the question of, is the individual a singularity, and the question of justice tied to that individual?
Yeah.
Thank you.
If you don't look at statistics, you have no right ever to use the words more, less, improve, decline, increase, decrease. Those are statistical concepts. What they consist of is talking about individuals. Now, you just get out of breath if you say, well, and Lisa and Joshua and Mary and Sam. The statistics consist of individual human beings. If fewer people get killed, that's fewer individuals that suffer. If fewer women get raped, that's a whole bunch of individual women. You could point to them. It just gets tedious to list them all. It's much more convenient to count them and to indicate the numbers. So you can't. Let me finish. The other thing is, I do really think you've correctly identified a tension between different conceptions of the good, of what we ought to strive for in our social institutions. And I think that raising the welfare glory of the group, insofar as it doesn't simply consist of the aggregate welfare of the individuals, has been a huge cause of violence, because you can always sacrifice individuals who count for nothing if what you value is the glory of the race, the nation, the religion, the ethnicity. I think the idea that, of course, we value the collective good insofar as it helps everyone. If we have cleaner air, if we have a less corrupt judicial system, if we have good roads and good schools. So there is the collective good, and it's good because it benefits individual men, women, and children. But when it comes to valorizing or privileging or glorifying the group, and the individual being just like cells in a body, so no more significant than clipping your nails, that's when you get the ideologies that justify sacrificing individuals for the greater glory. And historically, those are the circumstances that lead to bloodbaths. That's the ideology that says you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And it's renouncing that ideology that I hope that this institution symbolizes, and that I think holds out the hope for further reductions in violence.
David Pankratz. The question I have is, why is it so counterintuitive to believe that violence has declined? And to sharpen that question, I've been involved in 3 different places in the world: Baghdad, Eastern Congo, and the inner city of Winnipeg, and I have no trouble convincing people that these are places where there's more violence than we experience in the suburbs. They have no trouble believing this. However, when after I'd read your book and I tried to tell these same people that there's actually a decline of violence in the world, that met with a lot of resistance. So why, given the compelling evidence that violence is in decline, is it so much easier to believe that the world is a violent place rather than a less violent place?
Yes, an excellent question, and one that I've thought about a lot. There are 2 reasons. One of them comes from our cognitive psychology, which is that we assess risk and danger and probability more generally by conjuring up examples from memory. Many of you have probably read Kahneman's recent bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, and this is one of the many cognitive biases he talks about. And so when you try to think, what's the world like? Well, you think about Syria, you think about Congo, you think about Winnipeg inner city, and you think, oh my God, that's violent, that's violent, that's violent. It's violent. What you don't do is sit down and go through systematically every part of the world that's not in a state of war and use that as your denominator. That's what the human mind does not do. And this is amplified by the news, which is, of course, how we get our information about the world. News is about things that happen. It's not about things that don't happen. And further amplified by the policy of many news outlets that if it bleeds, it leads. This is that people, for the same reason they enjoy simulated violence in the movies and in Shakespearean tragedies, they enjoy violence in the news, or at least they're captivated by violence in the news, and so the violent events get highlighted. If there is some part of the world where no war broke out today, or if there's a school somewhere in which there was no shooting, or a city in which there was no terrorist attack, that's not news. And so we kind of forget about all those. And the point is that only when you gather the statistics do you realize that the boring parts of the world, the parts that you would not go to, where there's no war, there's no terrorist attack, it's just like, what a bore for a journalist. But there are more and more places like that. That's the story that I've been telling. The second reason the first comes from our cognitive psychology in interaction with the nature of news. The second comes from our moral psychology. And we care more about more and more of the world and more kinds of violence. And so we often don't realize that as our sensitivity to violence increases, we're apt to see and find more of it. And in fact, there may even be a kind of diminishing returns where we are more and more vigilant for the lower and lower amounts of violence that remain. Now, I think this is a good thing, but it can just get our sense of the state of the world out of whack. And I'll just give you an example of the last 5 years or so. The campaign against bullying, little boys picking on other little boys, has been such an area of concern that the President of the United States gave a speech to denounce bullying. Now, when I was growing up, this would be a joke. Bullying was just another name for childhood. Boys will be boys. What, you want your sons to become sissies? We care now more about little boys, as we should. And we care about all kinds of categories of people that we didn't care about before. There were horrible wars going on in Africa in the 60s and 70s, in Angola and in Mozambique, and people barely noticed. Now, because of the expanding circle of sympathy, we do care, and so it looks as if there is more violence, but we just care more about the violence that exists. So it's a good trend, but a distorting trend.
In the question period that followed the lecture in Winnipeg, most of the questions were from people who objected to your main thesis, and that is that they said violence was increasing rather than decreasing. What do you suppose is the source of that critique?
They get their information from the news, and news is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. As long as the rate of violence hasn't fallen to zero all over the world, any act of violence anywhere is going to make the news. And so if you get your sense of the world, and if you assess your general sense of risk and danger from salient examples, and that's the way the human mind works, you're naturally going to think that we're living in an age of bloodshed and explosions and terrorism and war, because you don't read about all of the countries that are at peace. If there's a school that hasn't had a shooting today, you're not going to have the eyewitness news guy with a microphone and the sound truck standing in front of the school. And so we don't tally up all of the opportunities for violence that don't result in violence, and we have no idea what the denominator is. It's only when you look at data that you get an accurate perception of the state of the world.
Well, whatever the best explanation for the decline of violence turns out to be, I think it has profound implications. For one thing, it calls for a reorientation of our efforts toward violence reduction from a moralistic mindset to an empirical mindset. That is, instead of just lamenting, why is there war, perhaps we should ask, why is there peace? Not just what are we doing wrong, but what have we been doing right? Because I hope to have convinced you that we have been doing something right, and it seems to me to be rather important to try to identify what exactly it is so that we could apply more of it in the future. Also, the decline of violence has implications for our assessment of modernity, of the centuries-long trend that has eroded family, tribe, tradition, and religion, which have given way to individual rights, cosmopolitanism, reason, and science. And it's particularly, I guess, fitting that I make this point here in this temple of human rights. Now, everyone acknowledges that modernity has brought us many gifts: longer and healthier lives, less ignorance and superstition, richer experiences. But there's always been a current of nostalgia and romanticism that has questioned the price. Is it worth it if we have to live in the shadow of terrorism, genocide, world wars, and nuclear weapons? On the other hand, if despite impressions, the long-term trend, though halting and incomplete, is that violence of all kinds is decreasing, I believe this calls for a rehabilitation of the ideals of modernity and progress, and it is certainly a cause for gratitude for the institutions of civilization and enlightenment that have made it possible. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard University and author of many books, including The Better Angels of Our Nature, published in 2011. Dr. Pinker was speaking at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, part of a lecture series called Fragile Freedoms: The Global Struggle for Human Rights.
I don't think human rights come naturally to us. I think we're naturally likely to invest morality with tribal loyalty, with the glory of the group, with conformity to the status quo, with obeying a legitimate authority, with keeping the purity of ourselves and our society. And the idea that every man, woman, and child has a right to flourish and not to be harmed, and that's where our moral and political efforts should be directed, is really a new and exotic development in the history of ideas, and it's one that we must cherish. And so I was particularly glad to give the lecture at a temple to human rights.
The lecture series was organized by Arthur Schaefer and his team at the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics at the University of Manitoba. Thanks also to the staff of the museum. Recording, Brian Harder. Production, Dave Riddell. To learn about upcoming episodes of Ideas or to sign up for our online newsletter, visit our website, cbc.ca/ideas. And remember that we're also on Twitter and Facebook. The executive producer of Ideas is Greg Kelly, and I'm Paul Kennedy. The Hourly News is next.